Oh my gosh, the contractions. Whew. I don't know about the contractions, yo. I'm genuinely curious what happens when other people learn English. Do they just straight up just throw them into contractions? Yikes. Do I say hello, what's your name? No, I don't. I say what is your name? Cuz it's more formal that way. Interesting. I have the like gozaimasu issue with saying hello, what's your name? I would probably say hello, what is your name? Or I would actually put the emphasis, man, there's some fun things to share with people who are learning English, because I would actually emphasize name. So, hello, what is your name? As in, I want to know your name. The most important thing is your name. So, what is your name? I might even pause a little, as opposed to like, so it wouldn't be like, well, actually, they kind of pause too, right?
こんにちは。お名前は
Yeah. Konnichiwa. Omae wa. Onamae wa. Right? Onamae wa. Konnichiwa. Onamae wa. Right? So it'd be, hello. What is your name? With the emphasis on name. Obviously, none of this is all that really important, other than squeezing out every ounce of your English when you're talking. Because often, since what is considered one syllable, or it's gonna, a lot of times the emphasis is gonna end up on what's your name, or like starts with what's and then what's your name, as in what's your name. So it will be emphasizing that person's whatever. But I would say, what's your name? Hello, what's your name? As opposed to, hello, what's your name? Which is what I would say the vast majority of native speakers would probably have. It's the second syllable, which emphasizes possession, but it doesn't emphasize the object of the sentence.
こんにちは。
I'm starting to do this English thing backwards because it matters in Japanese. It matters a lot less in English. I mean, this is just my snobbery, obviously, because being a native English speaker, but also not really speaking around what we talked about yesterday. Oh yeah, I forgot about to mention our discussion yesterday. After I was so unceremoniously dismissed as not important. This is what I mean by why it's very important to draw parallelisms in the culturalisms of English and Japanese, at least English and Japanese. You can really learn a lot from the Japanese linguistic style and apply it to English. Because the English baseline is so low, in my opinion, because of its flexibility. Generally, in my opinion, respectfully, it's not necessary to command the English language in the same way you have to command the Japanese language, because the baseline is so much higher. However, it doesn't mean, which when I was drawing those graphs, the English range is arguably even higher than Japanese, but the lower end is incredibly high too, because the English baseline is a lot lower requirement than Japanese, in my opinion. So you must know a lot of things in Japanese to even reach to, I would say, a sufficient understanding of when to use words and when to enunciate or use your intonation and what to get the nuances. That's just baseline to get to native sound. In English, that's just nondescript. There's just, if I were being asked to describe the average English speaker, I would be unable to, because naturally I don't speak like the average English speaker. I switch English voices as I see fit. So I wouldn't sound like this when I'm not learning something, and I wouldn't sound like this if I'm casually speaking, as compared to giving a lecture. So it's very difficult to really know. Like, I would say, just like native here's a fun parallelism, right? Here's a fun parallelism. So a lot of you can run the behavioral parallelism between. Okay, I get it. Yes. Oh no. Okay. So, oh, the hotkeys are not working anymore. Okay, so for example, lots of English speakers would tell me that pitch accent, right? Pitch accent. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it because you're just learning Japanese and etc. But this is coming from someone who has command of English, right? A native English speaker, generally speaking, that is not aware of pitch accents to begin with. So intonation, right? It's under the umbrella of intonation. So a lot of times pitch accent is really also not that mandatory as per usual in English, right? So naturally when you're learning Japanese and you've command Japanese, you would wait to the end to understand pitch accent. Well, generally pitch accent is a ear training thing first. So you don't have to work on it actively, not too much, but you can choose to work on it actively if you want. A lot of times this becomes a passive process for most English speakers. Because generally speaking, when you're using English, you're passively figuring out intonation. You're not actively learning English intonation. So, for example, why does a coach sound different giving a speech, right, versus a lecture, like when they're lecturing their players? Well, this is intuitive. It's not actively learning. This is usually passive. When you start hearing people who are in seminars and presentations and various things, the phrase well spoken is just thrown out based on intuition most of the time when it comes to English speakers. You can just feel it, right? And in a way, we can draw parallelism to Japanese speakers, because actually the vast majority of native Japanese speakers, much like the way we learn as a biological organism as a kid, I guess vast majority, I'm going to say more than 50%. It's pretty conservative. More than 50% is will not be able to accurately discern their pitch accent. Because it's already reached a stage of intuition. So even a minority group of native Japanese speakers would be able to explain and communicate and express what their pitch accent is explicitly, even in Japanese, not just to a foreigner, but to other people. So this experiment has been done quite a few times by individuals who acquire Japanese as a second language, right? And they become native-like by then. And they inquired about this pitch accent, how to communicate this pitch accent to people who are acquiring Japanese as a second language. It's the same in English. It's a very noticeable thing. And it's only noticeable to someone who has acquired the attention to intonation and pitch accent. For me, it is very dissatisfying if I do not pay attention to intonation. Much like a singer, if you sing a lot and you've gone deep into the voice manipulation, or even a voice actor, for example, anyone who's spent a lot of time ear training and manipulating your voice, it's very difficult to ignore the inconsistencies between how you visualize and hear yourself and enunciate with what you're hearing and seeing. So you hear yourself in a way, and then you try to create a certain sound, and it doesn't connect with what you see and hear back. So here, for me, I am going much slower than most people because I want to establish if I can make a sound that reflects my hearing in a pitch accent. So it's not about how accurate my pitch accent is at the moment, which I agree with most people. Trying to memorize pitch accent, that's a different story. This requires active intellectual things. That's very stressful. It's incredibly stressful and can be very overwhelming if you're not used to it. English speakers do not worry about intonation most of the time. Naturally, then it becomes less exhausting when you're in English, when you're using your native language. This is very much the same with Japanese native speakers. I could not find a sample so far amongst 17 to 20 instructors who are universally regarded as pretty decent source online to agree that the majority of Japanese speakers actually understand their own pitch accent and express it explicitly. In English, I would increase that. I would say, generally speaking, it's got to be less than the upper higher education. So I would say less than 25% of English speakers can manipulate their pitch, their intonation and pitch accent in speech. However, there are lots of professions that do this. It just doesn't necessarily translate to their speaking voice. Oftentimes they compartmentalize that. So like, for example, a singer wouldn't necessarily combine it with their speech. Oftentimes these disciplines are considered compartmentalized. So when you have, quote, your singing voice and your speaking voice. However, there are some transferable skills that are intuitively transferred without explicitly showing that. For example, a singer can transfer the manipulation of their sound that they're trying to make with voice acting. So deliberately adjusting your pitch accents and your enunciation and intonation to fit a specific role. So how flexible and dexterous you are in terms of how close the ear is to what you think it sounds like, and then creating the sound, those are active processes. It's very difficult. It takes quite a long time before you form some sort of intuition. And that part drives me insane right now in Japanese. So oftentimes whenever I'm thinking of words, when I first acquire a word, my learning curve is so much slower, I would say, because a lot of thoughts go through my head. And it gets faster over time, but definitely not faster than someone who is someone that's passively imitating for the time being. And that's great. I think this gets you a lot of progress, for sure. It's just not the more interesting thing about it. If my vocabulary is stunted by half someone else in the same time, that's perfectly all right. I am more interested in the nuances of the language that isn't right on your screen. So even using something like Duolingo, all I really am here for is hearing the same 6 or 7 people pronounce the same words, like the same sounds. How do you sound different all the time? How do you sound well-spoken or very emotional or perhaps quite calming? Is the manipulation of intonation. And in English, it's super flexible. So sometimes you can enhance the words you're saying if you have command of it. I would say, relatively speaking, the vast majority of occupations require a very low understanding, like very sufficient understanding of English intonation. It makes the difference, but most people intuit it. Like when you go on YouTube, you hear someone like, I don't get it. I just could hear this guy talk forever. Are they Heibaning? Are they speaking in Heiban English? And if people aren't not aware of Heiban is like very monotone, flat, but slightly rising. So lots of times when people want to hear a very relaxing person speak in English, they would often get closer to someone who's speaking Heiban, as in really monotone, just very relaxing and vibing. The cadence is the same, very similar spacing, so that it sounds, real talk though, SM7B it's also bass boosted. So you get the lower end, like all these manipulations. English is more flexible in that, but rarely ever use the advantage of the person. Oftentimes, English is always emphasized in a way that says, use your natural voice for speaking. Don't try like something crazy, Find your natural voice. That is where you start, for sure. I agree. Although, I'm going to be super frank. I do not sound like this when I'm having a casual conversation with my friends. And I most definitely do not sound like this when I'm lecturing. However, the fun thing here is, because the baseline of streamers speak a certain way, right? The spoken words, it's all relative. English has this relativity. There's no baseline to reflect it. It's determined by the sub-community as opposed to like a set of rules for Japanese, right? There are regional pitch accent differences. We talked about that, and dialects, right? Even dialects go as far as changing the words and whatnot and become unintelligible. Even within those dialects, there are pitch accent differences. And that's the richness of speech. You can legitimately make your voice sound unique without ever changing the words. So how does someone find your voice recognizable? Command the language you use. Unfortunately, a lot of times when you have the same speech pattern and you're just like Heibaning it all over the place. I know I'm using a Japanglish contraction now. Heibaning it. If you're Heibaning it all over the place, that's the first thing that goes out the window in public speaking. So in English, we've had the habit of let's execute all our words, and then oftentimes when you become very mechanical, everything becomes monotonous. That's Heiban. It's slightly rising. It might slightly dip a little in English, so it's up in, but it's generally in the box. And then when someone says, oh man, dude, you're so relaxing, but I just fall asleep when I listen to you, because it just feels like brown noise. It's so relaxing, but I'm definitely not engaged. Just you're vibing so hard, but things you're saying are just going through my brain and making me at ease. That's a great thing if you want to be at ease. Now, imagine if you're in a situation that you have to teach someone something. The last thing you kind of want to reach for is a sleeping pill. So, generally speaking, rise up, go down, pause, and now isn't that nice? So there's lots of nuances to English as well, and it's reflected in Japanese. I actually think some of these people who are very skilled in Japanese, it's often stereotyped as a Heiban forward starter. So beginners are definitely, like myself, I'm a beginner in Japanese, are often, they default to this idea like, well, the safest bet is Heiban. Basically, stay flat so that you're neither really too high or too low, right? So that's fair. If you start at a flat line, then you can focus on how to be flat, and then you can probably discern highs and lows as you learn all the stuff. Yeah. English is more the same way. The more technical you become, the more monotonous it sounds, because you want to keep a steady pace, steady accent. You don't command the use of rigor. You know, like saying rigor and rigor are two different things, and you can accent and be flexible with it, right? Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that you had a bad day. Try to pep up a little, you know? Tomorrow's a brighter day. If you don't feel that way, just, you know, try to smile a little every once in a while, right? You just change up and down, even though your actual voice and your tone of your tenor of your voice doesn't actually fluctuate too much. Like the actual tone, whatever, it's still the same person speaking. However, you can definitely manipulate the English language, almost quite exaggeratingly. And that's largely why I think when video games are in both Japanese and English, I love it when the video game enables the English voice cast to truly flex up and down their English. English has a bigger tolerance rate in not confusing words with other words. Japanese system inherently has intonations that, and like, I still don't know if hana and hana, like hana and hana and hana are is that how they differentiate between nose or flower, or it's also context specific? It's just hana for both, and then it has to be context specific. Because I'm a beginner in Japanese, these are the questions that are the most interesting to me, because I earnestly feel like they might even change pitch accent to emphasize that, because hana is nose and hana is flower as well, based on context, right? So far all I know is it's context specific. That's all I know. And then we have things like Nihon, right? Nihon versus Nihon. And those are two different things. Like, it can be interpreted in two different things, but context usually help with that, right? Context usually, you could be saying two of something versus Japan. You can say two of something versus Japan. Thankfully, Japanese have a lot of context clues when you place into sentences, so you can figure it out most of the time, which is what my best example of describing what it feels like to be an English speaker, but in the Japanese context. Because as an English speaker, it still actually relatively doesn't matter, right? If you say Japan versus Japan, or Japan, like, you know, Japan, it's still just, it might be disconcerting and discomforting, but you're not largely require any form of context to know what the heck you're saying in English. So I'm trying to really get into the shoes of Japanese by just trying to slowly take it all in. A lot of times there's that dreaded, oh, am I going, see, am I going to form bad habits, right? That's generally that dreaded phrase, forming bad habits. Well, here's the thing. So I talked about habit formation quite a bit. We'll do this as a digression for today. So habit formation, right? Habit formation. Most people eternalize habit formation. Habit is when it becomes passive. So if you are actively doing something, so this is in contrast to actively correcting yourself. So yes, true, you can definitely form habits passively. As in, if you get something quote unquote wrong, and then you repeat it without knowing it's wrong or undesirable. I'm gonna say without knowing. I don't like the word wrong. Without knowing it's undesirable. Right? Undesirable. That's when it reaches habit formation. However, if you are constantly actively thinking, thinking is too implicit. Actively changing or placing intent. The intent in actively placing does not become passive yet. It's only when it becomes passive that is habit formation. So when you're trying to learn something, when you're constantly learning something or observing, for example, observation is a part of learning, right? When you're constantly observing something, generally speaking, this prevents habit formation. Salient habit formation. So a lot of times it may seem like you're constantly doing the same. Say the constantly thing comes up, whatever it might be, and you do it without inherently even processing it anymore, then yes, that would constitute as a habit. And if it's undesirable, most people dub it as bad, for sure. There's a slight finer difference between learning and observing and then ending up with the same results. In terms of the process of learning, you are actively changing something that is ending with the same results. That is still learning. As in, you know what doesn't work. That's way different than passively repeating something and accepting it. So that's what habit formation is. So generally speaking, yes, it's nice for people who are very good at speaking, who has gone through the ropes, and then offer advice about preventing bad habits as a general rule of thumb, right? Preventing. However, for the individuals who may not understand, for people who are not really well versed at the way they learn, it's implied that you do not require such bad observations to learn. So here's a great example. Hands-on versus planning, right? One is very underrated and the other is very overrated. Right now, this is over. This is under. Both of these processes of habit formation have overlaps. And generally, the overrated thing, which is planning, that overlap gets accentuated. So whatever is in planning mindset is overrepresented. When in reality, you do both. You try to do both anyways. do a little hands-on, do a little planning, do a little hands-on. Try to do both because there are properties that don't overlap when it comes to learning. And things like discovery. Discovery does not overlap between planning and hands-on. Discovery is predominantly hands-on. And that impacts learning process. Mistakes inherently is favoring hands-on. So you can flip this and say what else is desirable. Well, there's a lack of mistakes, right? And a lack of discovery. So I chose something that is inherently desirable right now in the main field of learning, or like people who are trying to learn something, and then something that's undesirable. So a lack of discovery is actually largely undesirable because without discovery, there's no motivation. There's a lack of motivation. It inhibits, with a lack of discovery, it inhibits motivation. It inhibits novelty. What it does promote is it promotes tedium. And that's boredom. I'll use an example that a vast majority of individuals would say it's okay is very acceptable, ironically, instead of the other way around. So you start a language, right? You start a language and you tell yourself, this is going to go back to someone that I met only briefly, who said, as a linguist. So this phrase tells me that this person skips foundations, in my opinion. It's more likely to skip foundations. So what's a foundation thing? Well, I have been in science for very long, right? I have been in science for a while now. And one thing that's in the back of my head that does occur quite often is, hey, if I know biology, then sure enough, I should be able to get a head start on other disciplines, right? It's that $1 million question. And I'm going to tell you now, the hot take is that there isn't a correlation. As in, there are people who say they swear and live by it, don't, and meh. There isn't a significantly sharp enough correlation. So here's what I mean. So if I understand biology, somehow it's implied that I guarantee that I can pick up chemistry really, really quickly. I'm just gonna be real. There is very high chance, just as good of a chance, to have interference from biology because of nuance, and just as good in the stereotypical sense that since you have foundations in biology, aka science, that foundation is transferable to chemistry. So what this is highlighting, this type of mindset is highlighting planning, the planning concept. And I do use this. I start with Japanese because it's the furthest away, and I plan Mandarin next, and then Spanish. And because of this planning, I'm relying on my intuition, right? What this doesn't substitute for is being actively hands-on, as in being actively observing. So what I'm saying is, this particular guess that suggested that because they are a linguist, it is not important to form the foundations and connections that almost every human being has to approach, which is the mindset of learning something. Being someone who has a PhD in biology, it is foolhardy, in my opinion, foolhardy to suggest as a PhD in biology, I will pick up physics faster. I'll pick up chemistry faster. You can suggest that. In your mindset, you could say there might be some leeway. So there are overlaps that I can take advantage of. Right? But then when I go to do these things, I am still actively hands-on. And that's the important difference. You don't tell yourself, in my opinion, when it comes to learning, if learning is your priority, not skill acquisition, if learning, like skill practice, if skill practice is your predominant state of mind, absolutely, go pick your favorite thing and stick with it. Learning is combining actively hands-on observation and taking advantage of understanding what the overlap is. So both planning and hands-on. And what's an example of hands-on? Well, I still have to read and learn hands-on physics 101. My PhD in biology, it would be foolhardy to just assume that physics 101 is not valuable to me. Much like a linguist suggesting that it's not important to know how to motivate people to learn a language. Honestly, that just tells me that that person isn't as deep into linguistics as I would imagine. I think one of the true ultimate big picture goals of a linguist is to preserve language. Well, preserving language also involves people using it, understanding it, the cultural intent, and underlying barriers to that language. And I totally probably spelled linguist wrong the entire time. That's besides the point. And here's another one. When you're younger and you have less learning experience, things that are too easy are optional. Well, here's the thing. I agree. I absolutely agree. If you take Duolingo and passively learn from Duolingo, if you passively learn from Duolingo, then yes, it will probably be too easy. Because during your planning phase, you fail to realize that Duolingo has a gigantic range of accommodations. So this is a model where the weakest link, the baseline, again, this particular guest that came yesterday said that it's not important to understand the baseline of a language. Well, to me, it matters quite a lot because how you design learning programs is based on the lowest baseline, not the highest baseline. It would be incredibly foolish to think that you want to preserve a language. If a language is struggling and you are not aware of the language's baseline, statistical baseline, how are you going to make the language more appealing to people to preserve? I mean, you could archive it and just say, oh yeah, you know, here's the historical records of this language, and no one uses it. It's forever in history. Fair enough. I mean, that's okay. That's academics for you, right? So the rest is history. So when it's too easy, it's really just based on the lowest baseline. And for me, I agree with most people that Duolingo's baseline is incredibly low. I think the kanji section is super low, like incredibly low. And the idea is, why do I look like I am struggling learning Japanese using something that most people find too easy. Is because I am changing what Duolingo offers. Because if it's too easy, most human beings are going to passively learn. So much like the hot take on Duolingo, most of the time, people will say, oh yeah, use Duolingo as a supplement, right? And I don't like the word supplement. You could use Duolingo as a framework. So what's the difference between Duolingo as a supplement and Duolingo as a framework when it comes to the mindset of a learner? This means it's optional. It's implying that it's optional. This means that you can integrate it into core learning. Supplement means it's passive. It'll contribute to a passive learning process. As a framework, it becomes an active learning process. What am I extracting from finding out how to say oma, oh no, ona maiwa, right? Ona maiwa. That's probably not it. Let's hear the sample again. This is the first time I'm hearing this phrase again.
こんにちは。お名前は
Onamaiwa, right? Onamaiwa. Onamaiwa. And then dip down. That's where I'm hearing Onamaiwa. Onamaiwa, right?
こんにちは。お名前は
Onamaiwa, right? So, the idea is this stuff is incredibly important to me personally, not to lots of people. But when you start thinking that things are supplements, you do not, you largely, or a person would largely sideline something, as opposed to always actively be hands-on. So here's one thing. Here's a comment. Well, I wish Duolingo had X, Y, Z to make it harder. Well, it sounds like you know exactly what to do that Duolingo doesn't do. So, how do you do it? Right? I imagine when you say it's too easy, when someone says something is too easy, it would imply that this person can make it hard, probably. Make it harder, right? Well, there's a difference between asking for something and doing it. Well, what am I doing? For example, I'm actively using Duolingo. The things it lacks, I'm using Duolingo to find out what it lacks for me. So all the things, a lot of times when people evaluate products, in my opinion, they evaluate products by critique, right? By critique. What it has and what it doesn't have. What works, what doesn't work. This, to me, is a passive process. What you can do when you're using a product is offer what I call constructive criticism. And oftentimes, constructive criticism involves, yes, there are things that it lacks and it doesn't lack. So I did this as well. And then illustrate that it works with Duolingo. And what happens when constructive criticism is accurate? Duolingo as a product or other people, it can improve. That is constructive criticism. And how does this tie back to the whole status thing? My XP allows me to skip foundations. Well, it just means that when you use this mindset, you don't improve. That's not to say that that's different from you need to improve. And for me and many of my colleagues, post PhD, right? Post PhD, I think most of us can agree that it is so hard to want, or even let's just say to want to be multidisciplinary. It's just that it's very difficult. So ultimately, when we stay in our fields, we do improve a bit in terms of our specialties. That does come at a cost of how well it transfers to related fields. The deeper you get into biology, the more dissonance, a lot of times, at least what's observed, is the more dissonance it is to pick up chemistry or even go into structural biology. It's really difficult compared to like diving into molecular biology, and then you suddenly need to go to a lecture on macro levels of biology, like cellular biology. And that's the human condition. So when someone is incredibly an expert, it's really, it blows, it doesn't blow my mind. It's just disappointing. I think, in my opinion, specialists requires some understanding of the human condition. It's not like they're not doing anything impressive or they're not trying to save time. They are. Their specialists are trying to save time. They're making assumptions, and usually they work out because guess what? Let's go back to the graph, right? If you're a specialist and you're framing everything around your specialty, your baseline is higher than someone else's baseline who is not in a specialty thing. So when you're like me, for example, my generalist baseline probably can put me lower than that specialist's baseline. So the question is, how do I raise this baseline of engagement? This deals with skill acquisition, but really this also deals with skill acquisition, which most specialists are really interested in, how fast you gain something. However, it also very greatly affects learning. And any specialist, in my opinion, if you really want people to understand you, it's very important that you understand how to get people to learn the things you want them to learn. So it's really ironic, in my opinion. It's a little bit extra. It's a little extra yesterday, a little extra disappointing that a person who considers himself as a person that focuses on language acquisition lacks communication skills. Knowing a lot of language does not necessarily translate to communication skills. It's the same mindset where, like, if you learn a lot of language, you are naturally better at communicating skills. Well, yes and no. It's not a given, but I would even lean towards even less no. It actually makes you less and less likely to understand someone who is learning a language. So does all this matter? As I spent this digression, it does. It humbles me. All this stuff humbles me. Is I know that if I made language super easy for myself, I stop challenging myself. So if you have no problems learning language, absolutely, go for it. The very successful people who pick up language, a lot of times, they're challenging themselves in other ways. That's what keeps them engaged. And those are, in my opinion, the balance of hands-on versus just being a planning specialist. Those people who are still using like 16 different apps to try and then figure out, hey, am I right? Or am I wrong? Not the ones that go around and say, oh, you know, I know 3 languages. I don't need strategies to learn what a noun and verb and pitch accent, I threw that in as a curveball. Pitch accent is important. So what I mean by this is I love teaching. I love being an educator. The last thing you want to do is simplify things. There's a difference between simplifying and making it comprehensible. When you simplify, you lose active participation. Comprehension deals with demonstration, and use of appropriate communication. So one can learn pitch accent, right? And then communicate it. Not simplify it by saying, it's not that important. It's not that important. Native speakers will still understand you. I agree with both. It's not one or the other. I absolutely agree with you. These points of simplification is absolutely acceptable. I am choosing not to make that easy on myself. I do not like it. Just like most people who say things are too easy and then contribute it to tedium and boredom. So why the heck did I, as an educated person, one would assume would maybe learn something very quickly, spend like 8 hours straight on 5 kanji? Well, I'm trying my best to be active and then using those active experiences to make learning lessons for myself. And these learning lessons can be demonstrations for others, whether they are there or not. Because I am not making these like formal things. They just come and go as I'm reevaluating the way I learn. So learning Japanese, just because the next language, I'm still going to do the same thing. Like next Mandarin, still doing the same thing. Spanish, still doing the same thing. I have to understand that even through all the planning, I must at least test the things. That's the difference between actively and empirically testing all your learning stuff. If learning is your primary objective. Learning is my primary objective. If your primary objective is to acquire the language as fast as possible, you skip things. You definitely go through shortcuts. Like a very prominent YouTuber, I don't even have to say the person's name. Most people are probably familiar. They demonstrated how quickly they can become fluent in multiple languages, and they focused on conversationalism, right? Having the phrases. Inherently, they're applying like 10-ish techniques while doing that act. So what they did was they demonstrate their how they can appear fluent, and fluency is an arbitrary perception, as much as they attempt to standardize it. So naturally, yeah, this person acquires it really quick because they focus on those elements and they tackle those elements in the manner that tugs at a lot of things that they do well. Naturally, that might not translate to a lot of people. So that's kind of the idea. There's no give. Like there's no given or implicitness based on prior experience. It's through the bootstrapping of whatever you're learning. There are definitely places to start though. And when things become overwhelming, it's true that you can simplify. I think simplifying difficult things is a very reliable strategy. However, one must remember to build up again to complexity. Otherwise, right? Otherwise, this will likely lead to bad habits, or what people consider bad habits. And I tried not to do this because I don't want to go through the step of untraining bad habits. And the bad habit is oversimplification. If I can handle it, I choose not to oversimplify. I choose to increase comprehension. That will slow you down. It will slow you down a lot. When you're building foundation, it's the slowest stage in learning. The first hump, the activation energy, is the slowest stage until you get the gears rolling, and become a well-oiled machine. Then you stop learning. Learning takes a back seat. When the gears start oiling, you start practicing. You enter the phase of practicing. And most people feel like when you're practicing, then you're competent. Like, that's good. Generally speaking, I want to remain in the stage of learning. Rarely is practicing more rewarding to me, so I will naturally say a lot of things that involve learning, not practicing. So if I were to say become a professional linguist, I would largely focus on language learning versus language practice or acquisition. Regardless of when you acquire fluency or competence in a language, you cannot do anything without stepping through the door and having accurate learning process. Even speed is relatively slow, will always be relatively slower for the same person if their learning methods and mindset are compromised. Right? Are compromised. That's my hot take. It's a thought that I had from yesterday, and this is generally what motivates me most of the time to talk about things deeply. Even the most benign things, I have been challenged before, and I totally understand their perspective, where some people say, what's the point? You might be seeing things. You might be seeing. I got this a month back or so, 2 months back. You might be seeing things where there aren't things. There aren't things. For example, when I was playing a video game, someone said, stop trying to make things a bigger deal than they are. This kind of stuff. Like, absolutely. But you see, I agree with you. To you, it's not a big deal, right? This is like the specialist, a specialist who skipped foundations. Like, oh yeah, you know, you don't need to know this. Like, just skip it. It'll be much faster to just skip this part. Don't waste your time. Absolutely. If that's your goal. This is literally what I'm doing. I am seeing things where there might not be things. Hear me out here. What is Duolingo missing? Okay. So when someone uses Duolingo, they say, oh, this is missing. So I wasted my time. It's like, no, you know exactly what Duolingo is missing. So I'm going to fix it. Duolingo isn't going to fix it yet. Like, we have a product. So did I waste my time? No, I didn't. I found out what Duolingo is missing for me. And I fix it. I add. So if I am not actively trying to see things where there aren't things, you actively don't fix things where there aren't things. So kudos to that guy that thinks whatever their time is more efficient. But generally speaking, when I'm doing something, I'm actively doing it. So if it's missing something, then I must find ways to fill it in. I'm always actively learning and using things, not passively. When you use a tool, you know, it's like, oh no, like this tool doesn't do this. Well, I guess I'll just skip that step. It's a shame there isn't a tool that removes the necessity to problem solve, right? To problem solve and critically think of a solution. One of the biggest things between critique that most people are, in my opinion, critique that most people use it for is the lack of problem solving. So when someone says, oh yeah, this tool, it's garbage. It doesn't have this part in it. Okay. Have you tried something to fill it in? Because if you don't understand how to fill it in or offer solutions, it also demonstrates that you're incompetent in even knowing if that is a missing thing. Because you have no demonstration or understanding that it is missing something. You're pointing out by passive observation what it isn't. It can be anything. Like, for example, you can point at an apple and say it's not an orange. It's lacking orange. An apple is lacking orange. That is a critique. It's a very obvious critique, but it's a critique. Fix it. Can you fix it? Well, I can't turn an apple into an orange. Oh, now you're getting it. That means you have criticized an apple for not being an orange because it's not intended. Welcome to the world of criticism. Welcome to the world of constructive criticism. When you criticize a product, you have to know what is it. Is it missing it by intention? Is it missing it by design? If it isn't, and you believe it can be integrated into a product like Duolingo, demonstrate it. It gives you credibility. It's not the same as saying, yo, my friends, as a 18-year vet electrician, this is bad. Well, not only that, I feel it's ironic to me when someone says, as an 18-year vet, and all they could say is, this is bad. That's what is the word? Simplification. So how do you perpetuate misunderstanding? And how do you perpetuate misinformation about your passion, your field of desire, and your specialty? You reply and condition people to expect oversimplification from people like you. So, if I'm a biologist and someone asks me a biology question, I wouldn't just say, everything causes X. And usually the word is cancer. Most people talk about cancer around me. I would try to make something engaging with understandable while not minimizing sacrificing complexity. What does that do? The number one thing that I have a pet peeve about, I do have a few of them, and now I'm pretty sure most people notice that I have occasional pet peeves, and one of them is treating the other person like they're not important. Treating the other person like they can't have different problems. That here is oversimplification. Oh man, you don't know Avogadro's number? That's kind of weird. You should really know Avogadro's number for unit analysis for basic chemistry 101. That's oversimplification. And what happens when you do that? You sound condescending. And when you sound condescending, you are not credible. In my opinion. You actually diminish your credibility because you cannot stand up to the challenge of explaining your thoughts as an expert without simplifying it. And that's kind of a pet peeve. I think using that whole thing, go on YouTube. Just go on YouTube, right? And then look at comments. English is just not explicit enough, but oftentimes when a comment starts as a human being, I'm joking by the way, I'm being facetious here. As a human, ... this qualifies you to offer some oversimplified comment. I mean, at this point, I think most people are doing this ironically. I like to believe they're doing this ironically as opposed to unironically, which is those individuals that I encounter quite a bit because they often address me as uneducated, because the prevailing perspective is if someone's going slow, it means they're struggling. And that's largely true, really. I mean, if I was uneducated. But generally speaking, these people, because they're in the hustle culture, they don't stick around to even know anyways. You know, hustle. Get in, get out. And my message to people, well, my hot take is, I won't get in and get out when someone needs help. That's not challenging. If you walk around and say, not my problem, fair enough, but know that that is the easy way out. So when you say, oh, this game is too easy, or this app is too easy, make it harder. Because it's harder to actually come up with solutions and constructive criticism than just saying what it isn't. You can do better. And I believe you can do better. I actually truly believe when people are really happy, they're really engaged with their subject matter, they create beautiful things, incredibly beautiful things. And to me, taking a dump on Duolingo, which statistically is arguably have a structure that is the most popular thing, and then elevating your credibility by taking a dump on someone on a product that has a reach of millions of people. That's like saying, when I have a reach of 100,000 and I want to be also 5 million, but I can't contribute to it and then bolster my own credibility, right? If you are able to improve Duolingo, what would happen? Your credibility will go up and Duolingo will probably support you. So instead of fighting against fire, fighting, I don't know instead of fighting uphill, you can ride the wind, ride the sails, right? Until you get ahead. It's often YouTube, for example, is built on criticism. Unlike the scientific community, I wouldn't say all of it because that's an oversimplification, but most of the scientific community emphasize collaboration. And collaboration often involves constructive criticism. And to me, if you're not or those English speakers, right? Or maybe secondary English speakers and native English speakers, the word constructive, it often implies building something. The vast majority of critique on YouTube commentary is destructive criticism. And that's my little, like, I don't know if someone have already, I'm sure there's a content creator out there that has already considered the difference between destructive criticism and constructive criticism. I am very privileged and happy to know that during my career, most of my life, I was around people who are constructively criticizing the things I need to do because I'm always building up, not building down. Duolingo lacks certain things. I want to show actively what they lack. What did they lack? Well, some people say Duolingo, one criticism is that Duolingo relies a lot on back and forth translations, right? Back and forth translations. And I agree. Absolutely. Back and forth translations. So what do? I put blinders on this myself. I read this statement, read it verbatim, say it in my head, then look at the solution. When someone says, oh yeah, I got in this bad habit of just pulling the right answer beforehand, it's like, that sounds like you chosen to do that. And you did not have the skills, to change that. And that's perfectly all right. It is a criticism of its design. Absolutely. I will agree with that person. Like, this Duolingo does associate translation as their first and foremost tool. What is your constructive criticism then? So you got the criticism. So how do you constructively demonstrate to Duolingo or to yourself that you can alleviate this problem? Well, I did. And guess what? It makes me a lot slower. Like, I have only learned at most 110 vocabulary words since I've spent more than I think I'm over 150 hours of Duolingo now. But what did I acquire that other people didn't? Well, you have to watch the videos to really find that out. But I can tell you that I've acquired a lot more than what Duolingo has offered me. However, I use Duolingo to figure out what's missing. What would I want in it? And I do it. So I have been passively listening to a lot of vocabulary. I have been doing a lot of things. And over these last 16 days or 15 days, it's been a really, really wonderful experience. Even meeting people that I disagree with fundamentally, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet people who actually vehemently disagree with me in my approach to learning. That's what makes people constructively critical about themselves. I am often incredibly constructively critical about myself. When someone offers advice, I offer a counter advice. And then when they think they can push back, I welcome them to push back, because the idea is to be constructive about it. You offer what you want or what you see, and then you're also open to hearing the other person. And these discussions they do matter to me. So when someone comes around and say, oh yeah, I've done this before, it doesn't matter. It's like, well, then get out. That's pretty much it. Like, there's no credibility. There's no mutual respect. The last thing you want to do to build your rapport, like to develop a rapport, I mean, it's very acceptable if the person's like, you're not important. Goodbye. That's fair. Totally fair. However, if you were trying to build rapport by trying to say, I'm an excellent language person, and then you say that doesn't matter. Well, I don't care if you said you are the best language speaker in the world. You just shot yourself in the foot by failing to build rapport. And I don't know about you, but if a businessman comes up to you and say, wow, your coat sucks, buy my coat, it's better, I don't think you're going to be very successful. Perhaps if you lean in on it even more, you can double down and say, dude, your coat sucks, it's old, it's out of fashion, I have a new coat that's in fashion. It's like, you can double down, and it's possible to get fear to work, for sure, against an incompetent target, for sure. So the only reason, in my opinion, if I'm reading deep into that comment, is that this person doesn't treat me as a educational equal, and they legitimately just sideline what I spent 30 minutes discussing by saying, oh yeah, I know better, that's why this is not important. It's like, well, I hope that professionally you don't go around doing that, because no one will respect you, because you don't project mutual respect. It's fine for a stranger, totally fine, and I'm sure that person is going to move on to meet lots of people that are important to their lives. I'm just not one of them. And it doesn't change the fact that when that person just said it doesn't matter and laughs, that person to me is ironically uneducated. So kudos to you to lowering your guard, I suppose. In a public space, just like the Japanese people, I don't lower my guard when I'm in public space. I want to be presentable and agreeable. It's the way of, it's how I am very Asian, right? Asianese, right? Because that is harder, in my opinion, than speaking your mind and stuff, ironically, even though I am American. And I do encourage people to do that. So that person did. No hard feelings. It definitely doesn't change these facts. Anyways, that was a bit of a low point to leave it off on. But yes, hot take. To summarize, destructive criticism can be a symptom of specialization, right? Specialization does not imply skipping, being able to skip foundations. It may just as likely provide just as much interference, and learning involves planning and hands-on. And this, to me, I'm gonna violate something here, is it's a human condition. This is a little bit of an oversimplification. So I do admit this is an oversimplification right here. In the interest of time. So in the interest of time. So the next time you learn something, as long as you're actively working on it, it's oftentimes a choice when you're actively learning to make a habit happen, to establish a habit, basically, to establish a habit. Bad habits come, and then the last thing is bad habits often come unexpectedly. When a good habit happens to come unexpectedly, that's getting lucky. So when someone says, oh, you might establish bad habits, that's usually something that's unintentional. People don't go out of the way to establish bad habits. To mitigate that frequency is to remain actively learning until you can establish a habit that you intend to have. So it's not really following someone's advice to prevent doing something that could result in a bad habit if you let it happen. That's what most people prey on, which is don't do this because it will lead to bad habit formation. It's assuming that the person is unintelligible or unintelligent and are not aware when they're actively learning something. If they're passively learning something, absolutely. So you're doing it, in my opinion, I like to believe that I can engage people with interesting topics and let them be actively engaged the whole time so that they can choose how to form their ideas and then settle on it intentionally. Not the idea of preventing someone from doing something, hoping that they don't do it because they're incompetent or they passively learn things. There are extreme circumstances where that's the case, like alcohol abuse or depression. Those are the times when, yes, it is probably very encouraged to use that preventive measure. But all these YouTube videos I see now on Japanese and stuff, don't do this, don't do that. Yes, don't do this and that passively, as in don't do it without thinking about how it impacts you. Fair enough. That's written between the lines. You can do bad things that end up working for you if you are constructively critical about yourself. That's all I wanted to say. And all that came from the talk about pitch accents, really. The person that was condescending or something, that was a little icing on the cake. I was trying to connect everything from previous. But there you go. Good digression. Thanks.